From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters.
In conclusion, as I was satisfied that the involved officers acted lawfully throughout their engagement with Ms. Korchinski-Paquette and her family, there were no grounds for proceeding with criminal charges in this case.
That's Joseph Martino, the director of the SIU, Ontario's police watchdog. Those words bring an end to one of the most divisive investigations into police conduct in recent memory. The SIU is called in whenever there's a case of assault, serious injury, or death that involves police in Ontario. On May 27th, 29-year-old Regis Korchinski-Paquette fell to her death at her apartment in Hyde Park. Police were called to the scene after her family said she was facing a mental health crisis. Toronto police said Korchinski-Paquette fell accidentally from the balcony. Her family believed the officers had a role in her death. Those were explosive allegations, and in a political climate where the calls for police reform and action against anti-black racism keeps growing, thousands protested in the streets of Toronto. The SIU cleared Toronto police officers of any wrongdoing in the events of Korchinski-Paquette's death. But that doesn't close the book on the SIU. Its role is being looked at way beyond this one case. Questions about how transparent it is and whether the watchdog has any real teeth in police accountability haven't been settled. We're talking to our colleague Alicia Hashim, courts and justice reporter for the Toronto Star. Today, we take a look at the ones who police the police and whether they're any good at breaking down what some call the blue wall of silence. Alicia, thanks for taking the time to dive into this with us.
Happy to be here.
So now that the dust has settled a little bit, what did the SIU report on Regis Korchinski-Paquette's death say?
So the SIU report ultimately concluded that none of the police officers, the 7 police officers who were on the scene that night, that there was anything criminal that they had done. Essentially, it found that they had made reasonable efforts, that they had attempted to de-escalate the situation, that their approach wasn't a marked and substantial departure from a reasonable level of care in the circumstances, and that there was no suggestion of an undue show of force by the officers or unnecessarily aggressive behavior. So after kind of going through a number of accounts, civilian accounts, there was an independent witness who had sort of seen part of what had happened from outside, and the officer accounts, including the subject officer. That was the conclusion of the SIU.
So essentially that fully clears all of the officers that were on the scene. The SIU says that they weren't acting inappropriately.
That's correct. And, we heard yesterday from the family of Regis Korchinski-Paquette and their legal team, and they feel differently, and they're going to be providing more information about why they feel differently in the coming weeks. But they feel that there is a route to criminal conduct and that police didn't do enough at the time.
You've covered a lot of cases where SIU gets called in. And in this specific case, you reported that this SIU report is unusually detailed. What was unusual about it?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. I think it's important to mention that prior to 2017 and the Andrew Loku case, this kind of report that we got yesterday would not have been publicly provided. And so it was only after a great deal of outcry from activists and community around that case and some of the excellent reporting from my colleague Wendy Gillis that these kinds of reports are even available. So prior to that, we would just have the SIU either clearing somebody or charging somebody without much information to explain why that decision was made. This report, it's in its length and its detail, and partially maybe because of the analysis that was done around what criminal conduct could be done, because it isn't maybe as simple as was the use of force reasonable or something like that, which are many kinds of SIU cases. It's very, very detailed. And someone I spoke to yesterday who studies police oversight noted that it seemed to have been done with an awareness that a great deal of people are paying attention.
Right, that they know that this is a high-profile case, that a lot of people are interested in the outcome of this SIU report.
Yeah, and there's a couple of other things that are unusual about it. One is that the subject officer participated in an interview, which is not something that is required to happen. So they have unlike witness officers who do have to participate in the investigation, a subject officer doesn't. And there's also some other things that are unusual. There was an acknowledgement of the social context of Regis Korchinski-Paquette's death, that it happened following the George Floyd protests and a reckoning around racism in policing and police violence. So that's also something that hadn't been mentioned before, even though other kinds of SIU investigations have occurred in the exact sort of same kind of context and outrage around these things.
And before we go even deeper, I kind of wanted to have sort of a defining of terms. We read a lot about the SIU. A lot of people in the aftermath of Regis's death were calling for it. But what specifically does the SIU do? Like, can you give us a sense of how do they conduct their investigations? Who do they talk to?
Yeah, so the SIU is called in when there are incidents involving police where there's a serious injury or death. And so that encompasses somewhat of a wide range of conduct, includes sexual assault, and homicide or fatal shootings, those kinds of things, and sometimes other kinds of calls where police are on scene and someone dies. They conduct an investigation where they collect evidence from people who were there, witnesses, just like a sort of a normal investigation, right? Talk to the officers that were there, including, so I guess there's what are called witness officers who were present but didn't participate, and then there's a subject officer who would be the person that was sort of actively involved in whatever happened.
Right.
They also collect video and whatever other kinds of things are available. Often sort of other people who aren't directly involved, to family or police, are generally quite important. So someone noted this in this particular report that kind of witness was very important in the Theriault investigation into the Devontae Miller. An independent witness is also quite important, sort of a neighbor who had been watching the incident. So those things are really important.
Especially watching the reaction from the SIU report. I was watching the tape of Regis Korchinski-Paquette's family, and they were very disappointed by the outcome.
We're totally disgusted with the outcome. We know that they're hiding things and they're not mentioning certain things that happened. And it's not right. It's unjust, and we're not okay with it.
Part of what they said that struck me was the tone. Like, they were expecting to get this result. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of this discussion about the SIU, that there is this perception that this is a watchdog that ultimately boils down to cops investigating cops. Where does that perception come from?
Right. So this is something that was a perception that was acknowledged in the report itself, which I think is important to note. This is something that people have been saying for a long time as a concern, and it was created in 1990. And before that, it was police investigating police. And this was intended to create a civilian, arm's length, completely separate organization that would now handle these investigations. And it arose out of sort of similar protests to what we're seeing today around the deaths of Lester Donaldson, Michael Reed Lawson, and calls for civilian oversight. The thing about the SIU is, so the director of the SIU cannot be involved in law enforcement, and sort of the top people in the organization are not involved in law enforcement. But something that people have criticized over the years is that some of their investigators, particularly, they have some full-time investigators, but they also have people who are called in when as needed is the term that they use. And
right.
Those are sometimes former police officers.
Okay.
A large number of them are former police officers. Even though a former police officer can investigate an incident involving their own former force, sort of there's concern that just even having former police officers involved in an investigation would mean that there isn't that same kind of transparency or accountability, or that there would be some kind of bias. And in sort of one of the landmark report looking at the SIU, this is a couple of years ago, the Tulloch report, this was a question that was specifically asked. And Justice Tulloch sort of said there are some advantages to having former investigators involved, right? They understand how the police work. They understand how their experience can add a lot to investigating whether something was done right or wrong.
They know how to investigate people or chain of command. There are certain things that can help them.
Right, that they might have the kind of experience that they would have from being a police officer would then be an advantage in investigating whether or not something was done right. But at the same time, there is this perception of bias. And that's the most important thing about a civilian watchdog, as a number of people have said, is this sense of transparency, accountability, and independence. And that's really important. There has to be confidence, public confidence in this kind of organization. And this has been a real point of contention for people. And I would also note that we do have a lot more information in these reports now, but there's a couple things that aren't mentioned. And one of them is obviously the names of the officers involved, which is another point of contention. But we also don't know if any of the investigators aren't named. So we don't know if any of the investigators were former police officers. And there's an argument to say that may or may not be important to the quality of the investigation. But a lot of what we're talking about here is perception and faith in this institution that was opaque for a really long time. And it's only very, very recently that we've started to get this level of insight into how these decisions are made. So it's not, this is a couple of years in to sort of this level transparency. People still have a lot of questions and concerns.
Yeah, for a civilian watchdog, the optics actually do matter because public transparency and public trust in an institution is why they're there in the first place.
Of course. And this is so closely linked to, again, faith in the institution of policing. And there have, for example, going back to the Theriault case, there was issues around SAU not being notified. And so there's major, major issues with trust in policing. So it makes sense for a lot of those concerns to then be extended to an organization like the SAU.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be right back.
Among the other criticisms about how the SIU works, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, was the difference between subject officers, so those are the ones who are being investigated, they don't have to speak, or they don't have to give a statement to SIU investigators. Why aren't officers, the ones who are accused of wrongdoing or being investigated, why aren't they compelled to give their version about what happened?
Yeah, so this is another sort of controversial point, and the answer to that at this point is really that it's an investigation into criminal wrongdoing. And so just as anyone else involved when the police are investigating somebody, you have the right to remain silent. One of the former SAU directors, Ian Scott, recently told me after a subject officer in a different case didn't wish to be interviewed by the SAU. So he said, if you're compelling a statement from someone under those conditions, it wouldn't be able to be used in court, is his view. So, and that's kind of the whole point of the SIU's investigation. So there's sort of this right to remain silent, that you have rights under the charter that don't go away because you're a police officer. But their views, Howard Morton, who is another former SIU director and who's on the legal team for Regis Korchinski-Paquette's family, his view is that a police officer is operating under a very specific set of rules and circumstances, should be held to a higher standard, that you should be able to justify your actions and decisions in the course of your job, and that it's a different set of circumstances. So there's differing points of view, but at the moment, subject officers are not required to participate in the investigation.
In your reporting, have police or police unions, have they ever shown support for that idea, that latter point that was made, that police officers should be held to a higher standard or that they should testify? Have they ever shown any kind of support for that idea?
I'm not aware of that. And I think there is sort of a sense that their rights must be protected and that, it's a matter of due process to a certain extent. And so, I don't know that there is a push for the system to change in that respect. The SAU had for a long time asserted sort of or complained about non-compliance in general from police officers. So this is sort of had been a long-standing issue.
Right. In looking through SIU cases and looking at the year-to-year breakdown, you can also see the clearance rate of the cases where officers are found to have not been guilty of any kind of wrongdoing. And that's where a lot of community members actually take issue with SIU, right? Like, they point to those numbers as a lack of trust or a reason for a lack of trust in the institution. Where do those numbers fit into this conversation?
Yeah, I think yesterday, in the wake of the release of the report, we heard from Regis Korchinski-Paquette's family and from community members this real sense of inevitability, this sense of this is exactly what they expected. And that feeling comes from the deaths, the fatal shootings by police that led to the creation of the SIU in the first place, and that have continued since then. There's been a number of really significant tragedies where officers have not been charged and where people feel that the investigations left unanswered questions. And so, when people look at that clearance rate, it just reinforces this really strong concern that police aren't being held accountable in the way that they should be. And having civilian oversight is important. That was something that was being called for initially, but I think people are increasingly losing faith that that's enough to have the kind of accountability that's necessary or that goes far enough. There have been discussions around increasing the mandate of the SIU, as we spoke about before, about increasing the number of civilian investigators or investigators that aren't police officers or have that background. But overall, there's, as we've seen in the protests over the last few months, there's really this disillusionment in police reform. It all really ties together. And when people look at this kind of these overall clearance rates.
I know this is sort of a tough needle to thread, but you had mentioned that SIU over the years have taken steps for more transparency in terms of like releasing what the actual reports are, especially in Regis's case. They're very detailed about what their process was. In your reporting, have you seen the SIU kind of take more steps to address those concerns from journalists, from community members about accountability? Have we seen them try to tackle that head on?
There have certainly been some steps that have been taken. I think notably in Regis Korchinski-Paquette's case, there were, for example, many more updates about the progress of the case. And I would say that the report also came out much sooner than in a sort of a typical investigation. So there was obviously a recognition that it was important to have information out there. And, I think that the SIU is trying to sort of explain to people what their mandate is and that they are a civilian sort of independent watchdog. It's a tough hill to climb just because of the history of this, of people's experiences with this. And speaking to a professor who studies this, she talked about needing to go directly to these affected communities and engage with them and understand perhaps what people, what kind of changes and reforms they want to see and whether there is more that needs to be done. So yes, and in some ways this is the most transparent the SIU has ever been, but there are clearly people continue to have really pressing immediate concerns about whether that's enough. And there's information that can only be obtained, for example, through an inquest. Is that really an appropriate measure of transparency?
Alicia, it's a really difficult discussion, but thank you for breaking that down for us.
Thank you for having me.
That's the Toronto Star's Courts and Justice reporter Alicia Hashim looking into the SIU, the organization that investigates the police in Ontario. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.